Welcome to BIB Today, the daily business podcast from the Newsroom of Business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. A new study from PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, examines the attitudes and practices of Canadian companies on the issue of cybersecurity and privacy risks, and it raises several red flags. The survey found that executives believe their supply chains these days are so complex that they have concerns about the safety of the data that they're sharing. And only about 1/3 believe they have what they'd call a mature data trust process. I'm going to talk about that for sure. And indeed, only 4 in 10 believe that they even thoroughly understand the risks of data breaches. To discuss the report and its implications now, I'm joined by Jennifer Johnson. She's National Cybersecurity, Privacy and Financial Crime Markets Leader at PwC Canada, and by Alvin Madar, who's the BC Cyber Partner here at PwC's office in Vancouver. Good to see you both.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Jennifer, let's start with you. How surprised were you by these findings?
Really not too surprised. I think what we're really seeing is the evolution where cyber has been a top risk for many of our organizations over recent years. I think through the pandemic, we've certainly noted an acceleration of many organizations' path to becoming more digitally enabled, certainly coupled with most of their workforces working from home, in many cases continuing to work from home. So the digital underpinnings of our organizations have become that much more important to their operations. And with that brings significant business opportunities and some value that can be created through that digitization, but it also increases the cyber risk posture that the organizations must contemplate.
Yeah. Alvin, anything surprise you either?
No, not at all. Especially this is, the 2022 survey, and we had one in 2021 as well, right? And basically, it basically just like what Jen said, it basically just got more profile. Like the cybersecurity has become a high profile for the CEOs, COOs, CIOs of the world. And really, it's just a continuation of what happened last year. Organizations are becoming more digital. There are more breaches. There are more people trying to take advantage of the situation, especially people working from home. Like this hybrid working model, there's a lot of new security gaps that people have not thought about in the past.
Yeah. Jennifer, it's inherently natural for a journalist to focus on the negative and all that. So I'm going to ask you to play along with me here and ask, what's most worrisome here for you?
I think what's most worrisome, maybe 2 points, I'd say, is a bit of what we see as an expectation gap. And so you'll see in DTI, we explore from a CEO's perspective how actively engaged they believe they are in setting the right tone in the culture from the top. And then when we ask other executives and other respondents, how do they see the CEO and other C-suite members engaged in the topic around cyber and managing cyber risk? And we see a very clear disconnect there. So we see a significant opportunity for the C-suite broadly, both on the technical and the non-technical side, to really work much more closely together to close a very significant gap in expectations today. So that's one thing I'd really reference. Kirk, another thing you started to highlight in your opening remarks is really around the ecosystem. And so we know that almost no organizations operate in a silo these days. They're reliant on third parties, whether it be outsourced service providers, key vendors, and others. And what we saw in here was a significant kind of blind spot around understanding the cyber risk and how cyber risk is being managed at the third parties that you rely upon, right? And we acknowledged through the study this year and in previous years how difficult it is to get your arms around and your mind wrapped around cyber risk and how to manage that within your own proverbial 4 walls. Now extrapolate to your broader ecosystem with those third-party business partners, much, much harder, but certainly a bit eye-opening around the percentage of respondents that deemed it to be a blind spot.
Yeah, I remember, Alvin, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were companies that were actually discovering the depth of their supply chain. they assumed that they had 3 or 4 links, and in fact they'd have 7 or 8 links in terms of getting products to market. Is that like one of the big revelations that we're having right now?
Yeah, I think so. And it talks to like how organizations are becoming more complicated as well, right? Like there's a lot of complexity in an organization, especially when an organization grows bigger and bigger. And this is what they discover, right? Like when an organization acquires another organization, they discover that, hey, that other organization actually had like third parties, fourth parties, etc. And their own organizations had third party, fourth parties. So all of a sudden, when you combine all these organizations into one bigger organization, it just becomes very complicated. And during the pandemic, obviously there was a lot of reliance on outsourced service provider, third parties, etc. And when the organizations were doing an inventory of who they're relying on, that was when they were surprised by how much they're relying on outside parties. And at the end of the day, like the complication in itself is not an inherent problem, because as organization gets bigger, the ecosystem will become more complicated, right? That's how you can service the new customers, the additional people that they need to service. However, it is just having that hygiene, having that posture to actually know exactly who they're relying on is important.
Yeah. Jennifer, the role of the CEO was a real feature of this study, and I'm still scratching my head a little bit about whether they're making the situation better or worse. What did you conclude?
We think certainly where you have an engaged CEO that is really actively setting a culture and a tone from the top that drives the importance of security and managing security, and that it's not an afterthought per se. We are seeing that does cascade through the organization through its various levels, and how they take on new projects, how they think about their operations and reaching new customers, how they think about engaging third parties. And so that we think is actually a critical differentiator for organizations that are starting to reap the benefits of their cyber investments over recent years.
Alvin, in some cases, problems can appear to be very addressable, but this survey I found was finding executives quite concerned still about the future. What do you make of it?
Well, I think executives should be concerned. However, I don't think it's not addressable. I think ultimately the big thing is having that executive buy-in, and it's not just from the CEO, right? And usually, typically from before, it's always the CEO, CIO, and the Chief Information Security Officer that worries about cybersecurity. But I don't think that can be the case anymore, right? You actually have to get the buy-in from the Chief Operating Officers and your Chief Compliance Officers as well. So basically, you just organizations really need like buy-in from a broader group instead of just the technology group going forward. And once you actually have that buy-in, then they can start simplifying a lot of the processes to make sure that they have better visibility and better controls to manage cybersecurity.
Jennifer, one of the findings of the study was that one of the problems wasn't just organizational complexity, but it was avoidable organizational complexity. What is that commenting on?
I think it comes down to in many organizations we see you have different parties making decisions around the strategy of the business, around the operating model of the business that are done somewhat in silos. So you have different factions of an organization making decisions on their own versus in the context of the whole. And so that can create complexity within the organization from a people, process, and technology perspective, as well as with third parties. And so then they try to solve some of the specific cyber risks inherent in that particular part of the business. And so they might solve it with a particular set of technologies that are different than another part of the business. Again, you're adding complexity on top of complexity in that scenario, and we saw that coming through loud and clear in this year's results.
We've discussed before, Alvin, the overall prospect of trying to solve or mitigate some of the issues involving this. As you get a bit of a read on this in the last year or so, is there a greater sophistication emerging in all of these types of things in order to tackle with some tactics how you mitigate some of the threat?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that, especially what Jen just mentioned, right, is you want to start simplifying the process. And I think another way is to simplify the technology as well. So a lot of these organizations, a lot of the time they buy like different products from different vendors, and it makes the integration pretty complicated. So now what we are seeing is a shift in organizations saying that, hey, maybe we should, instead of a best of breed type of play, we should go with a platform play. Let's go with a single vendor or a limited number of vendors so that we can make the integration easier. So we actually get better visibility into what type of attacks we are getting. We actually have, a more integrated way to do preventative controls. So that's one of the ways that organizations can start looking into.
Jennifer, is it a matter of just simply shifting everything to the cloud?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think certainly, the cloud has its advantages. It also has some unique security considerations as well. But the reality is our clients are, like I said earlier, they're accelerating their path to digital and becoming much more digitally enabled. They're in many cases going to continue to have either a hybrid or work from home workforce. And so these risks are really here to stay. I think as Alvin started to highlight, we are seeing a number of clients start to look at, in this highly digitized world and operations, how can we simplify our operating model? And then how can we simplify our cyber solutions kind of layered on top of that? I think we're also seeing, Kirk, and recognition that, from a cyber perspective, we can only be so protected. So we're going to focus on the things that really matter. We're going to do best efforts in those areas, but the likelihood that we will get breached at some point, it is very high. And so how do we become a much more focused on detection and resilience? So we're seeing this conversation of resilience take a much more foreground than we have in previous years.
In both your cases, I have a question for you, and it has to do with the year-to-year kind of change that we might have experienced in the last while. A year ago, we would have all said, well, there are people working from home, but look, that's going to end. We're all going to get back to our workplaces and all that. Is there now a kind of a permanence arriving in the way in which our employees and our executives are operating, and does there still require yet another form of adaptation in order to secure the data? Let me start with you, Alvin.
Yeah, I'll say that, and I think now that we are 8 months or actually 11 months into 2021, I think the hybrid work model is here to stay. I think organizations actually see a lot of benefits of having a hybrid work model, especially from a talent retention perspective. I just don't think we can go back to the traditional way of working anymore. So what that means is all the risk that was associated with remote working will continue to be around. So, last year, a lot of organizations like, hey, 4 or 5 months, we'll all go back to the office. So we will have our physical perimeter to protect us. That won't happen again. So basically, organizations have to look at their physical security controls, as well as their logical security controls, as well as their remote security controls, to make sure that it protects the employees, in the office and working remotely as well.
Jennifer, are there massive learnings here in the last 20 months that now appear extremely relevant to the future for companies in terms of protecting their data? And now that we've entered something like a semi-permanent state?
I mean, I think like Alvin mentioned, a hybrid working model is here to stay. I think, again, when we went into the pandemic and we put in measures to enable our workforce to work from home, we kind of did so with a mindset that it would be a certain number of months. And so we were willing to take on risk for maybe that shorter period of time. For many organizations, they maybe haven't gone back to say, well, have we put the right security controls in place such that if this is going to be the way of the future and the way we just continue to operate, are the things that we need to tighten up? So we'd certainly recommend our clients do that at this stage, to really go back and reflect, because this isn't maybe a short-term risk-taking exercise versus the way things are going to be for the duration into the future. And so I think revisiting that is an important one. I think the other thing that we're starting to see from an overall perspective is that historically, a lot of the attacks have been on information technology in order to gain access to private or confidential data. What we're seeing over the last year is a rise in attacks on operational technologies. Right. And that is bringing a whole new paradigm that brings into consideration things like reliability, safety of individuals and environment in a way that we've not yet seen. And so again, I think pausing and reflecting on our security controls as it relates to our operational technologies is a critical step to take in the short term.
Do either of you think that that part of the hybrid that we're going to see in a permanent way now is also going to mean that you frankly just won't be able to do certain types of work remotely, that you're going to have to bring some types of work back to your office setting? Jennifer, what do you think?
I think, I think a lot of organizations are considering that right now. There are many things that we said could only be done on site. But the reality is we've found technologies and ways to minimize the risk, not eliminate the risk, but minimize the risk of data loss and data breach. Whether those are deemed to be sufficient enough on a go-forward basis, I think it's very much going to be an organization by organization basis. But like Alvin mentioned, I do see that the ability to work from home and have some kind of a flexible work model has become such a critical lever and tool with the workforce out there that it'll be hard to not offer that in some way, shape, or form. Again, I think it's going to come down to how much risk is an organization willing to take on there.
Yeah, so Alvin, so what are the things then that companies will need to do in order to essentially endorse or validate this new normal?
Well, so, so this is actually pretty timely, right? We were in the pandemic, that's why people were working from home. And all of a sudden, in BC here, we had a big flood, right? And now, it actually, people, the government, I think on Friday or something said that we should, if possible, let's make sure that our workers are working from home as well, so they're not using up the gas, they are not, trapped in traffic, etc. So I just think that, just between the pandemic and also the climate change as well, more and more of these types of scenarios are going to happen. So that's why, organizations do have to adapt to it. Actually, just want to go back to your point about some of the work that cannot be done from home has to be done in the office. That is certainly changing, right? And Jen touched on it. And I'll just talk a little bit about one of my clients, right? So they have a big operational technology infrastructure. Traditionally, all the engineers, they have to work at the office or work at the site, the plant, etc. But even now, they are looking at different technology to allow their workers to actually work from home. And one of the reasons is because, and actually this is something that we talked about last week, right? If there's a big flood, big natural disaster, they still have to service those stations. And if the roads are blocked, what do? We have never anticipated that our Trans-Canada Highway will be completely blocked off, right? And now people are starting to think about it. And that's one of the reasons why, this hybrid model will have to stay, because climate change is real and we are seeing the effects of it as well. So
yeah, and data sharing is not all about information sharing in a strict sense in terms of advancing your work. It's often logistical data sharing in order to make sure that trains run on time, trucks get to where they need to be, and ports are open. I want to thank both of you today. It's been a really interesting conversation. The study is quite fascinating. Recommend people go online to find it from PwC. Jennifer Johnson is the National Cybersecurity, Privacy, and Financial Crime Markets Leader with PwC Canada, and Alvin Madar is a BC cyberpartner here at PwC Canada's office in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief of BIV. Thanks for watching.